Today's episode is a free preview of our sister podcast, To Save Us from Hell. This is the only independent podcast about the United Nations. Co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I are bona fide UN experts. I've covered the UN as a journalist for nearly 20 years. Anjali is a professor of international relations at Fordham University who teaches and researches and studies the UN. And with our powers combined, we bring you insights and analysis about all things United Nations that you simply can't find elsewhere. Full episodes of To Save Us from Hell are available exclusively to paying subscribers. You can get a subscription via globaldispatches.org following the links in the show notes of this episode, or if you're listening directly in Apple Podcasts, you can unlock a subscription in-app. What we're doing with this show is truly unique, and I hope that you will help us keep this show alive and sustain our coverage of the United Nations. Enjoy the episode. In the coming weeks and months, what will the United States want from the United Nations, want at the Security Council, and not be able to get because it's alienating its allies? Welcome to Save Us from Hell. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am the editor-in-chief of UN Dispatch. I am the proprietor of Global Dispatches, and To Save Us from Hell is a project of Global Dispatches.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University, where I am coming to you from today. I teach and write and do research about the United Nations, and I am currently seated in front of the world's largest United Nations flag that appears in a room.
I can also see your many credentials behind you that listeners might not be able to see, but you are a well-credentialed Dr. Dayal.
I've been in this office almost 10 years, and I just put stuff up on the walls like 2 months ago.
So speaking about being in office a long time, or alternatively not getting an office that she would have lasted in for at least part of the Trump administration, since we last spoke, Elise Stefanik's name has been withdrawn as Trump's ambassador to the United Nations. You and I have talked a lot over the last several episodes about the implications of Stefanik, a diehard Trump loyalist and congressional leader, joining the administration as UN ambassador. But because of domestic politics, namely that the Republicans only have a very slim majority in Congress, her name was withdrawn. And this didn't exactly come as a surprise because Stefanik was the very first person that Trump named to his cabinet just like a week or so after winning the election in November, but still had not been confirmed, hadn't even had like a scheduled confirmation vote. So the writing was on the wall for some time that her nomination was on hold, and now it has been withdrawn.
That's right. In order to preserve a razor-thin majority in the House of Representatives and continue to push through massively unpopular domestic legislation, they need to hold on to her seat. And holding on to her seat means that Elise Stefanik doesn't get the seat around that horseshoe table at the United Nations, much to her own chagrin. The reports are that she was, up until the very last minute, trying to make the pitch that she should go to the United Nations to Donald Trump. But, you know, you play dangerous games, you win stupid prizes.
You know, the Washington rumor mill is now abuzz with who might be Trump's nominee for U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Two names have routinely popped up. Again, these are all just rumors, you know, media speculation. I'm happy to speculate as well as a member of the media and discuss each of these two people. But before we do it, you know, in a kind of remarks to the press earlier this week, in like kind of musing about this open position, Donald Trump said something like, I think, telling and revealing and interesting. He said, this position, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, is, quote, a star-making position.
Right.
So he understands the high-profile nature of it.
Yeah.
And given his just, you know, transactional nature, I sort of think it's going to go to some sort of donor, like last time around when Kelly Craft a mega Republican donor, replaced Nikki Haley as Trump's ambassador to the United Nations. But thus far, there are two names that we can chat about. We have Rick Grinnell, who currently is kind of like the U.S. special envoy for everything, but previously was Trump's ambassador to Germany and briefly served as the director of national intelligence in an acting role. And then you have David Friedman, who was Trump's bankruptcy lawyer, who became Trump's ambassador to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm happy to chat about those two men in particular. But any kind of thoughts in general about this open position, Anjali?
It's a high-profile position, which he himself seems to acknowledge. But the question of how much skill it actually requires at the end of the day to be the U.S.'s ambassador to the United Nations depends on what the U.S. wants out of the United Nations. If what it wants is a face to sit at that table and use the bejesus out of the veto, it doesn't require any particular amount of diplomatic skill. At the lower levels of political diplomatic interaction, the Trump administration is actually managing to go agency by agency and do some pretty destructive technical stuff in the absence of key political leadership at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. And so, despite the fact that it is a job that requires a fair amount of diplomatic skill and a fair amount of prowess to do well, if you don't want someone to do the job well, right? If you want someone to just run out with a giant hammer and hit things all over the place, you can put a strident, big-voiced person who's going to serve your administration as the public face there.
Mm-hmm.
That said, we've talked a little bit about how in the past, Donald Trump is not actually reflexively hostile to the United Nations. He likes the pomp and circumstance. He likes being celebrated. And in that sense, someone like Stefanik, who knows how to put on a smooth diplomatic face when she needs to, serves him well, because then he can show up and be feted as someone who knows how to make diplomatic connections, which he obviously can't do on his own.
Yeah. So there's kind of two kind of directions then this could take. And if your intention is to be like a big voice pushing people around at the United Nations, like asserting American dominance, your choice would be Rick Grinnell. He is a very combative personality, kind of has a reputation as an online troll, a staunch Trump loyalist. I first got to know him like in 2005 a little bit when he was John Bolton's press secretary and spokesperson at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. And he's always had just like very sharp elbows and kind of makes enemies very easily. And he would be the person you would pick if you want to kind of smash things and increase tensions around the place. And so that you're sending a very clear message if your choice is Rick Grinnell.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, John Bolton's famously successful and popular run at the United Nations wouldn't necessarily be the only way a Trump administration could put on a diplomatic show at the United Nations, but it's certainly one obvious potential pathway.
Yeah, and the other person, David Friedman, again, former U.S. ambassador to Israel, Trump's personal bankruptcy lawyer, someone who comes from like, right-wing Jewish traditions in terms of like American politics. So, someone you would send there if your kind of message that you want to send is the UN needs someone like David Friedman to defend Israel nonstop.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think part of the reason that Elise Stefanik also would have served Trump's purposes well at the United Nations is because she has made her name as a staunch defender of this particular foreign policy platform of Israel's, whether at the House of Representatives or in other locations. And so her sort of ascension to the position of U.S. ambassador to the United Nations would have brought that as well. I can see how that might be another potentially appealing pathway for the Trump administration.
So speaking of Israel, we are speaking Wednesday, April 9th. On Tuesday, April 8th, António Guterres met with families of hostages still being held by Hamas in Gaza and spoke to the press at a stakeout in which he delivered remarks just decrying the depravity of the situation in Gaza right now. Of course, once again, as he always has, as he routinely does, calling for the immediate release of hostages. But the fact is, there has not been a drop of humanitarian aid entering Gaza
Yeah.
in nearly a month since the ceasefire unraveled, just compounding an already dire humanitarian situation. Meanwhile, aid workers, including at least one UN worker, have been targeted and killed by Israeli forces over the last several weeks. Like that cycle of aid workers being attacked, of this stranglehold of aid being restricted from Gaza, has returned and returned with a vengeance. We've seen this kind of movie before, right? Where you have the Secretary General decrying a lack of humanitarian aid getting into Gaza. Meanwhile, the Security Council is doing nothing about it. Like, what gives? Like, what more, if anything, could the Secretary General or the UN do right now to just both fulfill its humanitarian mandate and also just try to promote the general idea of a cessation of hostilities?
Yeah. One thing that the Secretary General said repeatedly over the course of his press takeout was that we saw the positive effects of the ceasefire, that the ceasefire worked, that it protected people, that it enabled life-saving aid to enter Gaza, that it enabled hostages to be released. And his point over and over again was that we have to arrive at another ceasefire. We have to arrive at another ceasefire for people. We have to arrive at another ceasefire for aid workers to be able to do their work. The problem is that his tools to help parties arrive at the ceasefire are comparatively limited. It is probably the UN's key role at this point to advocate for a ceasefire and to try and put pressure on those parties who can arrive at that ceasefire, right? However, indirectly. It's not a great situation. It's not a great situation in part because, the UN is a target alongside other targets in Gaza. It's a target along other targets in the West Bank. It is a target in contravention of branches of international humanitarian law, which sit aside from the other branches of international humanitarian law that are being violated left and right. And so, unfortunately, this is one of those situations where what the UN's tools are essentially advocacy and information. They can provide information about what's happening. They can contextualize the problem. They can position themselves as neutral arbiters in the situation, and they can point out the costs of not being allowed in. But there isn't a clear tool by which the UN can strong arm its way in and provide aid in the absence of political support from other powerful countries to allow them to do so. We should also say that, there is broad political support across the world in many countries in most capitals for allowing aid in Gaza, for pushing for a ceasefire. But the key players here, the ones that can most clearly pressure the varying sides of this conflict, are not in that list of concerned countries.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, providing information is a good one. And just kind of keeping it in the news cycle a little bit, seems to be what the UN can do right now. Because frankly, even as the humanitarian crisis deepens because there's been no aid over the last month. I mean, they're not even letting like polio vaccines in. Like there's going to be polio in Gaza. Anyway, it's just to use whatever platform the Secretary General has to keep us, me and the media and other journalists talking about it, which is like a sad thing to think about. I mean, it's like the fourth rung down of things you could be doing about the situation. Just like, trying to get journalists to pay attention to it is like, far down the ladder than like doing something to stop the crisis. But that seems to be where we are right now.
Well, one of the great tragedies of Trumpism is that it produces a pervasive chaos where every set of wheels is falling off every set of wagons possible at the same time.
Yes, my 401k would agree with you.
Yeah,
right
mine
now.
too. I will be grading papers until I am 85. Um, But nothing is a distraction. That's the problem. All of these things are genuine crises, and we can't move past the sort of designation and creation of ever more crises by saying this doesn't matter. But then what happens is that crises that deserve our attention fall off the key radar of journalists, of policymakers. But this is a pressing crisis that, alongside many other pressing crises, but notably the direct result of American policy, is costing people their lives in just like horrifying ways, right? Like just the sort of like leaving aside even military action, right? People will starve to death. They will die of waterborne diseases. They will die of polio. Fundamentally preventable things. And the Secretary General's office is not a particularly strong one.
Like structurally, not just this guy, but structurally.
It doesn't matter who's in that office, whether it's António Guterres or Kofi Annan or someone else, right? The office is structurally not that strong. The sort of different powers available to the Secretary General are persuasive and interpretive. They're also sort of bureaucratic. So the Secretary General has the bully pulpit, can try and persuade actors. The Secretary General has interpretive power vis-a-vis international law, which means that the Secretary General can interpret the terms of the Charter or of other declarations in ways that they might think are more or less productive. And the Secretary General has the power to mobilize the United Nations International Civil Service. But those are not strong powers vis-a-vis the governments of states.
Yeah.
They are powers that depend on the governments of member states being open to persuasion, being open to receiving differing interpretations of international law, and being open to the kind of programming that the Secretary General can mobilize vis-a-vis the Secretariat.
So, Anjali, I wanted to move on to something else that António Guterres just yesterday in that press conference discussed, which is how the United Nations is being impacted, being shaped by the kind of crisis of the day, which frankly seems to be one that will endure for quite a while, which is the trade wars and Trump's tariffs.
So, Mark, what are you stockpiling on day one of our new tariff-ridden reality?
Well, it's really, what is the UN stockpiling, right?
Yes.
The UN diplomacy doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a broader geopolitical context, and the dominant geopolitical context at the moment is the fallout from this trade war. And António Guterres in that press conference, said essentially, no one wins from a trade war, which you'd expect him to do. But my question from you is, like, what will you be watching for as the ripple effects of this tariff war is being felt across economies around the world? What will you be watching for at the UN?
Yeah, I think if we separate this into two different potential buckets of consequences, right? The first is the economic bucket, and the second is the diplomatic bucket. In terms of the economic bucket, if these tariffs last a long time, and there's no reason to think, barring exogenous shock.
That was a free preview of our full episode. To unlock the episode, please go to globaldispatches.org and purchase a subscription. We rely on your support to keep this show going. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Save Us From Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on Chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us From Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.